All right, so the goal of this first part was, and the goal of this workshop on the whole is to find out how various kind of socialist education goals, different things you can do as chapters or as individuals floating around in space trying to gather together a chapter, what you can do to facilitate socialist education and how that education can fit in with your goals as a chapter, which I already listed. Now I want to go to the next part, which is shout out any way that you can disseminate socialist education in your community. Any way you can think of. Flyers. Flyers, tabling, give me some more.
Reading group.
Reading group, good one. Reading group, teach in.
Facebook arguments.
That is the true bastion of the new left, actually.
Film viewings.
Film viewings, good one.
Direct action.
Talking to people.
Let's go back to direct action. In the context of disseminating social, who said direct action? Yeah, what do you mean by that in terms of educating people?
Well, by whether it's occupation, some sort of reclaiming of something in society, perhaps putting on a performance, anything that is directly involving oneself, one's group, to provoke sort of critical thinking and challenge the status quo.
Okay. Any other ones?
Protests.
Protests, sure. Those are always very, very informative and fascinating.
Op-eds.
What's that?
Op-eds. Newspaper.
Very, very good one. I say as the editor of my newspaper. So what I want to do now is how to take like some of these goals. Maybe let's take one of these goals. I'm going to say, let's start with spread the gospel of socialism, because that's the one that I heard the most. Now, I want to see how we can formulate how to take these goals or this specific goal and use any of these strategies to say how that any of these can further that specific goal. Now, for example, spreading the gospel of socialism, I start with that. It's the most obvious one. Flyers, how can someone see a flyer and see that as a way to invite internal discussion about reconsidering their thoughts on socialism?
Don't write socialism on it.
Huh?
I mean, well, no, but actually, like, you can state like a goal, perhaps, of like, you can put like, nationalize politics. Well, actually, that's really contentious. Maybe something.
Reclaim the language.
You, please.
In terms of the flyer, I know this is like a kind of a thing, but you can say state different goals that we all have in common, and then on the back say socialism. Because, for example, I didn't really know that I was a democratic socialist until I came here, and then I realized, oh yeah, I guess I am.
Nice.
What way would just like list all the very important and famous people in American history that were socialists, like Helen Keller, MLK, people who have like created this country that we celebrate, and say, yeah, they were all socialists. So to show that there is a tradition.
All right, someone else. If they have any more about flyers.
You can lure people in with free food.
Sometimes. Please.
Like in a more negative way by just offering this as another, like pointing out the problems with this system as it is now, which I guess doesn't directly lead to socialism as an answer, but it is part of it.
Right. One, two more.
I was just gonna say, I feel like sometimes flyering can be really difficult to grasp attention. So maybe just a visually captivating image or something really like jarring or striking that kind of just like catches the eye.
Okay, and last one.
Reclaim the language. Like if you want to talk about liberty, let's talk about liberty.
Mm-hmm. See, now just from this conversation right here, we take one specific goal, which is the very broad spread the gospel of socialism, and we say how one specific method of socialist education can fulfill that in various different ways. Now let's like take this a little bit further and say various ways in which, like, talk about a specific plan that either your chapter or people you know or things you have even thought about could use any of these tactics or any tactics to, you know, as many of you have said, and I said, spread the gospel of socialism. Please.
Well, actually, to play on spreading the gospel, we had a Christian socialist priest come talk and try to, prove the argument that Jesus Christ was a socialist.
Damn right it was.
So I pulled in the left, the left Christians.
What else? What other events have people done to spread the gospel of socialism? This makes me sad. Okay, well, I'll start off. First of all, one thing that my chapter over at Wooster has had multiple times in the past several years that I've been here is that we like to have panel discussions. Like a really successful one we had a year or two ago was we had two professors, well, one person was the director of admissions, who was an admittedly left-leaning person, and the other was hardcore Austrian school economics teacher. Yikes. And they had basically a discussion with an audience and question and answer and stuff about what are the pros and cons of expanding the availability of higher education. Now granted, we heard a lot of things within this that, as a socialist are very objectionable to me about the, market importance of education as a commodity. But however, I think that, having this display of diverging ideologies is one of the most important things that you can do as any kind of ideologue. What other events have people done? Because I know, think of anything you can do to people that you can do or have done to educate people about socialism.
Well, you can help to make aware of other protests that are going on around.
Okay.
And sort of form a group that goes.
Now my question for you is, how does that fit into the realm of socialist education?
Well, I mean, they can get more involved and then meet other people who have similar views to them, and then just sort of see it in protest form.
Right.
Which can get you really excited about.
Right. See, that's what I would say as sort of, that's how you engage people with a certain kind of activism. What I want to focus on more about is teaching people the specific ideas of the ideology and praxis of democratic socialism. Please.
Well, I mean, I'm not actually participating in a chapter explicitly right now, but how I kind of was converted was just talking about real issues, just basic, just human stuff that, personally, I think that once you get down to, as we sort of talked about before, once you get down to understanding that if you like democracy, it just comes naturally that you would like socialist values. I mean, it happens. If you care about people, you care about yourself. I don't know, that's been my experience. Maybe I'm a little bit too idealistic about it, but I feel like sort of avoiding the stigma of the names at first and then slipping into it, because there is a slip, I think.
Yeah, Dan, I think you actually bring up a really, really great point to consider, which is that maybe some of the most important things in educating people about socialism and what we believe in don't always need to come from these very particular settings, as I'm trying to weave out of you guys for what specific things you can do. I think, one thing Andrew always says is you're never supposed to take your socialist hat off, which is that, when you're in a context of conversation where you make it known that you believe specific things, and for me, the College of Wooster YDS is very important to me. So in many different situations, I will always try and prepare myself and invite conversation about what is democratic socialism. A really great instance of that is there's a service project at the College of Wooster where people set up the cafeteria to just serve soup and bread, and it donates money to charity, but different groups run it. Now, I remember when the year or two ago, the Worcester Democratic Socialists were running soup and bread, I was there like serving people soup, and I had like multiple people who, you know, I could tell weren't exactly on the same plane as me politically, just come up to me and like, wait, doesn't socialism mean state control of everything, etc., etc.? And it's like, even just putting yourself out and tabling is the exact same way, whether you're tabling for an issue or just tabling for your group in general. I think one of the most powerful ways, and I have like met several members this way, is to just like put yourself out in some kind of social situation that invites like conversation about what you believe with common people. And I think that is one of the most important ways of, you know, as we say, spreading the gospel of socialism.
I feel that one of the most effective ways to talk about somebody who's a capitalist, who's criticizing socialism and stigmatizing it in all these ways, is just saying, hey, well, do you drive on public roads? I have a friend who's a capitalist who's on unemployment, and he sits around all day. I'm like, you're a capitalist, and you're criticizing all these things, but you are utilizing them at the same time. And that's one of the best ways to get to them, I think.
Yeah, like, and within the thing of just common conversation as a conduit to educate people about what we believe, it is so important to constantly remind anyone who like really challenges you to think of like, this is how many things in your daily life are public goods. And this is how much of a socialistic society we already are. And in many ways we are lacking. I saw another hand up, I think. Please. No, you have to. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. One question, I mean, maybe this has already been answered, but one question that always comes to my mind is, how do you get people who generally are just apathetic about politics all around to care in the first place? How do you combat apathy?
If anyone wants to call out while my back is turned, go ahead.
You let them know what in their life they care about is political already.
Right. That reminds me, like, one major campaign my school did was to get an anti-sweatshop agreement for school apparel that was made in the bookstore. We were going around to different groups to sign on to this petition. One of them we found was the Wooster Christian Fellowship didn't want to do it because, in their own words, we refuse to do anything political. And I think that's a very, I think that's a very legitimate point, that it's important to make it clear to people that all aspects of your life, from, you know, the clothes you choose to wear, to, you know, whether or not you drive, or anything that you consume, is inherently a political decision. I think that's extremely valuable. Joe?
Often you can host a forum, sometimes in coalition, sometimes as YDS, on a very pressing issue, let's say like student debt, but where you definitely have, whether it be a student or a faculty member or whatever, and often it's best if it's a student, who really has the best analysis of the issue, but also shows how the student debt crisis is a product of neoliberal capitalism, defunding higher education, and also the shifting of of risk from society to the individual, right? Personal responsibility rather than social responsibility for education. And one other thing is, and often they'll take the bait, make sure you have somebody who's stronger than a woman or a man who's going to beat the opposition. But you can often get the college Republicans and the college Democrats to say, have a debate on, you know, is the Obama administration a success or a failure? And you prove that it's a failure because it didn't govern as left-wing and anti-corporate way. It didn't deal with the foreclosure crisis, jobs, whatever.
Right.
And you win the debate. And often the Republicans and Democrats, you know, they're all hyper-politicos. They intern in Washington. They think they're going to win. But it's not very hard to beat them. But you never want to enter a debate where you don't know you're going to win.
Huh?
You always want to fix the terms. Right? Hey, this is politics. This is organized.
Steve?
I was just thinking it's very important to emphasize how it affects them as an individual. Like if you tell someone, hey, this affects you specifically, like you point to them, so it's you. I feel like that always helps, like just kind of bringing it home. Kind of helps draw them in.
That's a very good point. Like, I think student debt is probably one of the biggest issues with this. Like, we had kind of an abortive attempt at the College of Wooster campus for this one girl a few years ago basically had to drop out because of student debt. And there was it didn't work out super well, but there was an attempt at creating a movement around like this girl Ashley as a person, make it very clear to the people and the administration that this like issue affects us all very directly.
Maybe similar, a lot of young people are kind of passionate about the environment and climate change. So tie climate change to the to capitalism, and also I would say to learn the language of capitalist economic hegemony. Learn about the mathematical arguments for the free markets, and learn how to use them against them. Talk about externalities, barriers to entry, and just basically occupy economics.
That's a really good point. I think, climate change is definitely a great example of, along with student debt, once again, something that can draw many people who have a strong stance on a particular issue and draw that into a more broad worldview. And I think learning the language of capitalism, everyone should know a little bit of rudimentary economic vocabulary, because as I was just in the last workshop, that is probably talking with like market economists and like economics majors really isn't always that easy. So that's definitely a good thing to learn. Now Sammy, go ahead.
I guess I'm not alone in this room where I'm coming from as a person who's in a campus without a YDS chapter. How do you go about looking for like-minded people like yourselves so that you can start something like that?
Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, you guys have an anthro department?
Oh, what?
An anthropology department or philosophy? I find
History.
Social sciences and humanities. You can find like somewhat radical professors who can often link you to other students who maybe are doing reading, or in those classes you might find students who take these perspectives.
Find out what left-wing students study.
Sometimes you can go to other clubs like Gay Straight Alliance and like secular student organizations, and they'll have like people, and then you can steal some of their members and go, hey.
We work with a lot of other groups.
Work with other groups?
Yeah, even outside the college.
Yeah, definitely.
Canadians are being supported.
Yeah, and like as with several of the things we've mentioned already, things like flyers and a Facebook group, any like one individual really can't start that. And I think like these are things that anyone has access to and anyone can see, and maybe you'll get trolled, but who gives a shit? And that's just something you kind of have to put yourself out there with, I think. And I think for the final like 15 minutes or so of this, I want to go into sort of a broader question about the role of education in a chapter. These are all like questions we put down as goals, and this is like a much broader kind of abstract question. What do you think the role of any given YDS chapter should be in general? Someone could give me a very short summary of it.
Promote liberalism?
Promote liberalism?
Yeah.
Use another phrase, but... Well, yes, of course. Promote social democracy in what ways is the main question.
Well, just make sure that when you have a group of people who sort of, I don't know, they might start wearing pins and everything, but they don't necessarily really understand really any of the issues. They're just sort of going along with it because they're hipsters and like,
There's nothing wrong with partying.
No, they're not just sort of buying into it in sort of a weird like conformist.
They're buying into it as a hobby.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question, then I want to tie these together because I think you're getting at a really good point.
I mean, first of all, you got to put these people in positions where they're radicalized just by like being confronted with, say, like administrative power. And then after that, once you organize people on campus, you got to kind of like, you have to serve as a facilitator. You kind of like, you tease out elements that are more conducive to socialism or like a socialist kind of like modal organization, and then you kind of like repress elements that are more like, racist or sexist. And that's pretty much your job as an organizer on campus.
Yeah, I think we got at a really good point here. And I think one thing that I see between a lot of left-leaning organizations on the local and larger level is the constant challenge of being balancing yourself between being, like, at one extreme, just being a purely ideological reading group, and at the other extreme, just being an activist club that has no overrunning ideology. And I think both of these extremes can be mutually destructive. So what do people think? Like within, once again, to people who have chapters, do you find that your chapters move one way or another in terms of being like purely ideological or purely activist?
Our chapter at Penn State, we basically we formed another kind of sister group called the Leftist Symposium. And in that group, it's like other ideologies like anarchists, socialists, and other groups. And then what our YDS chapter does is bring what we talk in that other group, the theory of what we all talk about, into action with our campaigns. So that's how we solve that problem, by forming another separate group, also just for discussion, and then bringing that into action.
Right, and that, like at the College of Wooster, we had a chapter for, I want to say like 5 or 6 years now, and it was only till about last year, a year and a half ago, that we started, at the behest of, Andrew and YDS as a group, started actively including socialist education in each meeting. So the way that we bridge the gap is like we try our best to define our group as one that is predominantly driven by various actions we do on campus, of course, and that's the first step to it. But the way we did to like kind of push ourselves more towards an self-identifying democratic socialist organization is that we began at the end of each meeting for about 10 minutes. Like someone each week picks an article. Like many of them are from the activists, and we pick an article and then we just have like a quick discussion about it. And I think that's one thing where the activist as a source for education, I think, is absolutely invaluable. Like I'm sure people in this room have definitely written for it and have a part in it, and it's really awesome. And also, like, on the YDS website, there are like many large PDFs about democratic socialist critique of sexism and racism, etc. So basically what we've been trying to do is there is this really great wealth of literature from YDS and DSA, just like for the sake of educating people. And we found ourselves as a primarily activist organization injecting those into each meeting as much as possible to kind of tie everything together after the stuff that we do. Jerry, did you have your hand up?
I did, yeah. I mean, my personal view at this point is that, basically, YDS, at least what I've seen at Temple and what I've heard about from some other branches, that we are way too far to the activist side relative to the theory side. And, I think that ideally, it would be best not just to have a 10-minute, that's a wonderful start, and it's a really important thing at the end of each meeting, but it's best to even have, and not even just a reading group where you have like the introduction to socialism, but to get to the point where we're actually, having reading groups that can talk about the history of the American left, that can talk about, the history of, Marxist economic thought, not in a really profound way, but, so that we can actually sort of take on some of these other left-wing groups who are kind of nuts, but actually are in some ways more intellectual than we are, and not go as far in that direction in terms of like, knowing Trotsky, Treptow versus something, but going a little bit further in that direction so that the kind of literacy that we have in terms of sort of history and theory can sort of match some of these other groups that are maybe morally odious but have a better theoretical traction than we do.
Yeah, and I think that is a very important thing and part of YDS's identity as a left organization is that we're not just a Marxist reading group with chapters that are led by like general circular committee or whatever. And I think like the kind of motto that the YDS is the left of the possible reflects that I think we really do have to balance the line between ideological and strongly activist. Yeah?
Our group is sort of perpetually thinking, reading, and talking. We meet like 3 nights every week and we're, discussing things. We have a reading group. So we're very heavy on that side. One thing that's been helpful though is to kind of latch on to like our local Occupy movement to kind of help give us ideas and tactics to move forward with action, because that can be sort of hard on our campus sometimes. So that's one way to kind of mobilize and get movement.
Right. Joe?
You know, sometimes I think students underestimate how much some of them do know about particular things and how you can share. I mean, somebody may really know something about socialist feminism, or somebody may really know about some of the relationship between racism and domination and inequality in the United States. I mean, they can suggest readings and help sort of lead a discussion and stuff. The other thing that's often very good is if you're trying to organize, part of organizing is you really do have to achieve intellectual, if you want to use a fancy left word, hegemony. You have to gain respect and be considered that you really know your shit. I mean, every chapter, if you're going to work around student debt, around public cuts in higher ed, about accessibility, if you're at a more private university, in fact, there's places like Vassar, regardless of race or whatever, only 9% of the kids come from the bottom 50% of the income stream. Just the whole hierarchical nature of American education, and higher education in particular, you have to know that stuff. I mean, you have to know about defunding of state funding of higher ed, the cutback in the real value of Pell Grants, of Stafford loans. And, you know, you can have a group that works on it to really write good leaflets, write good literature. It doesn't have to be everybody. But collectively, you take on the task of, you know, you have to be able to agitate and organize, but clearly you have to be able to educate in order to agitate and organize. And self-education is pretty important. And peer education, you don't have to have some professor come. You can learn from each other.
Does anyone else have any examples or suggestions on how to bridge this balance between these two aspects of YDS, I guess, praxis? All right, well, that leads me to my final question about, you know,
dialectical synthesis.
Exactly. About the final question of, we've talked about how to educate, what the fact that it's important that you have the kind of balance between ideology and activism. Now, I think the most important question of this is, I want to ask, why is it important that we try to balance so finely the role between activists and ideologues? Why is it so important that, like, we have to bridge both? Why can't we just be purely activists? Why can't we just be purely ideological in the way we maintain our groups?
Well, put kind of simply, you know, we kind of have to balance, like, you have to know what you're talking about, but at the same time, you have to do something about it. Because if all you're doing is studying it, then, you know, you might know what you're talking about, but it's like nothing's happening. But if you're on the other end, you're doing stuff, but you have no idea what it is. So you have to find that. That's why that balance is important.
Any new voices?
Yes, please.
I don't want to interrupt the flow here.
That's fine.
But I really think we talked about how to do the education, because one of the problems I encounter is that when you try and explain these concepts to people who really support, you know, libertarian ideals or free markets, I mean, a lot of them haven't read Marx, right? So they're talking on, like, they're basically speaking on talking points. So for me, like, for example, I try and explain what socialism is. It's not, you know, complete state control of industries, et cetera, et cetera. But even to get to that point, you have to lay out all these, like, basic concepts, you know, because you're working against, like, an established order, so you have to lay out certain fundamental ideals. So can we perhaps talk about how people go about doing this? Like,
that's actually a very
like, can we reenact perhaps a conversation of some sort? Because, like, that, I think that would perhaps be more
all right.
useful. I don't want to, like,
All right, I'll be devil's advocate.
Control everything in your life?
That's right. You, really quickly.
I want to work hard.
Yeah, it's a question I guess for everyone to answer. So the problem with our campus is we got like 15 to 20 like really hardcore libertarians. And like they're the Facebook bullies, you know, like they're the people who are like waiting around with her, like Alexander Hamilton Institute blocks and like all this stuff. They're like, they sit there and they like spit in your face and they yell at you the whole time. And they have a really charismatic economics teacher who like a lot like indoctrinates a lot of young freshmen basically like thinking that like libertarian economics. So anyway, the point is, like, if you guys have this situation on your campus, you know, on the one hand, we could like invest a lot of our time into like, you know, trying to like recruit them in terms, like, because all they're doing is defending their own white privilege.
All of you socialists just want the government to control everything.
No.
Why? No, someone respond to that. Why am I wrong? Wait, one at a time. You go ahead.
Well, that we really strong civil liberties and strong democracy, so the powers of the
And
you said that
We believe in strong civil liberties and strong democracy, so the powers in the people, not the government.
All right, any new voices in response to that? All right, go ahead.
Well, when you just allow a libertarian society with free markets, then you're opening up the floodgates for you're opening up the floodgates to complete corporate tyranny, which go against civil liberties and individual freedom.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, this is kind of a little bit unrelated. I'm from a town that has a lot of like embedded white privilege. It's so much. Like it's scary. And what ends up happening is that you get into these conversations with people that day to day, all they've seen is this privilege. They have not seen people who struggle. They just do not see struggle. Basically I've talked to like teachers at our public school about to some extent is just like giving up. That it's literally not worth it to be combating these particular voices because they're so fixated on it. It's huge, and that there's enough of a moderate population out there. There is that might be a waste of time. Maybe just like showing that they're fools. That is a good thing, but not necessarily trying to indoctrinate.
Yeah, because you're talking about a world that they don't even see as real.
Precisely. Does that answer your question?
Wait, one at a time.
That's the question. My question is, you have these 15 to 20 students who are extremely dedicated to kind of talking to other people. Is it more worth your time to basically invest your time in basically educating them and getting them to realize that yes, socialism is a better way because they're more likely to be active. You have a chance to double the membership of your group in our example. Or should we focus, should we invest our energy in people who are moderate and kind of get them on our side instead? Whereas they wouldn't be as hardcore activists. So that's the question.
Right. I would suggest, I'll answer then, we can have a few closing thoughts. I strongly suggest that you should really appeal more towards the people who might be moderate or on the fence than the people who have already made up their minds before they ask the question. And the way that I would do that in responding to the people who are so strongly opposed to so strongly opposed to anything left-wing, the hardcore libertarians you talk about, is I think every chapter or every person maybe should write down a list of the most frequently heard talking points you heard. That's why I say, oh, you socialists want to have government control of everything. Another example is, oh, you talk about corporate tyranny. Well, expanding the public sector is just governmental tyranny. And I think it is extremely, extremely important to play the devil's advocate and realize, or also another great one, socialism has never worked. That there are much more complex answers to these questions than anyone who would pose them would actually assume. So you always have to be constantly playing devil's advocate with yourself to see which questions you will be asked.
Well, I think that's very important because the way that I respond to those kinds of people who are really, and there's tons of those in my head, is you have to know your theory and your empirical data really, really well. I mean, I know what you're talking about, you have to have a balance between activism and theory, but personally, I think that theory is super, super important, especially if you're talking about changing people's attitudes. Because if you can defeat their arguments well, using good arguments that from Marx, from whatever, especially data, that they can't respond to, they can't possibly defeat your argument, then you're sold.
Great example is, according to Freedom House, the countries with the biggest governments also have the highest rates of civil and social liberty. And I think things like that can stop an argument very well. Amber?
Yeah, I would also say in terms of libertarians, it depends on what you're talking about. There are hardcore, serious capitalists, and then there are kind of pot-smoking Ron Paul. Those people, very often, don't know what they're fucking talking about. So I would say it can be oh, well, I don't hate gay people, or blah, 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 this is what I think libertarianism means. And so they just don't know what's going on. I think you can genuinely talk to those people, but an ideological libertarian is not worth it because their ideology doesn't matter if you know your theory, you know your data. They're not operating on theory, good theory or good data. They're operating on craziness.
Right.
So I just address
Who
All right, wait. Let's hands up. You please.
I just want to sort of like play devil's advocate to that point really quickly, which is that I feel like the sort of cultural forces that we live in are so strong, like compel you so strongly towards this sort of like weird, moderate, like pro-capitalist but pretty thoughtless like view of the world, that like if you're willing to sort of like challenge that sort of like tacit approval of capitalism that everyone grows up here with, like that might indicate that you're sort of more like primed for socialism than someone who like sort of has no apparent willingness to challenge that like tacit approval of capitalism.
Any new voices? All right then, go ahead.
So when you're speaking with someone who has a completely fundamental like opposite of you, whether it's a neoliberal or like a neoconservative view, someone just like very far separated from the left, we found that arguing with them is not going to change their mind. Of course, we do want to like focus on the sort of moderate people, and I just want to see what you guys feel about effectively shutting down the opposite side. In addition to being positive pro-social democrat, what about the idea of sabotaging the right wing event? Not, of course, like physically like breaking things, but I mean showing up and mic checking, and I mean effectively shutting them up and turning their event into nothing.
All right, Dan, please.
Well, I think that's, Steve talked about this last night. It's like, can you envision a world where they could do that to you? And would you want to live in that world? Me personally, I would not. And I think that if we live the various, it becomes a moral agenda. And when we're talking about like what we want to do, it's like how we act will affect how other people act.
All right, we got about 3 minutes.
You're talking about two different things, though. I don't think you're talking about going to like a student group and mic checking.
No, not while they're having a group, but if they have an event, like a speaker, right? Because
It's mic checking someone in power,
not just
like
checking, but just
for barricading their.
All right, we got like a few minutes left, so I just want to run through like the last hands that were up real quickly. Yeah, go.
I was going to say, in terms of your theory, you don't always read Marx. I mean, read a book like Hayek and discuss what exactly is wrong with it.
Yeah. I think that's what one thing, going back to us not being a purely ideological organization, at least the way I see YDS, we're not Marxists, because Marxists can be really nerdy and really alienating and abrasive and useless. Yeah.
Well, even if you look at the history of what people always talk about libertarianism, is generally has been completely rewritten. When you have people like, if you look into what Adam Smith actually said, is he advocated for property owners and the wealthy to give a substantial portion of their money to the poor, and that's the only way it can exist. And of course, libertarians ignore that part and focus on a lot of these other parts. And then there's like, even like the early libertarians during the Enlightenment. What did the Enlightenment come out of? It came out of a very long time of just monarchy. So the libertarian leaders were all about power to the people at the bottom instead of monarchy at the top. So when they were talking about people should be able to have their own land and have a lot of rights, they weren't talking about allowing the people at the top to take the land and then make sure it's their rights. They were talking about just allowing every person to be allowed to have some land rights and support. So, I mean, just the whole libertarian movement comes out of the Enlightenment, and it's been so perverted.
All right, now that we're about out of time, I just want to kind of synthesize the main talking points that we all came across here today. Number one, each chapter should not be dominated by either theory or practice, but because, you know, when it goes much towards practice, you have people who are standing in the street holding signs and they don't know what they're doing. When it's all towards practice, you get really, really whiny Marx nerds who don't do anything. And in order to find that happy balance, like everyone needs to find their own, as individuals and as a group, the own ways in which they can familiarize themselves with like talking points from the right, play devil's advocate, and find the way that works for your individual chapter to have regular socialist educational meetings as frequently as possible. So I guess that's about it. If anyone has any questions, you can talk to me afterwards as I'm erasing this.